Every Wednesday at exactly 4 o'clock, a delivery van stopped outside Ruth Holloway's small house on Larch Street, and a young man in a plain gray uniform carried 2 bags of groceries to her front porch. He never lingered. He never asked for a signature, never rang the bell twice, never accepted the cup of coffee Ruth tried to press on him every third week or so, out of pure stubborn gratitude. He simply set the bags down, knocked once, and was back in his van before Ruth could reach the door, a routine so consistent that after 8 months, she'd stopped trying to catch him and had settled instead into a kind of quiet, grateful mystery about the whole arrangement. It had started the way most confusing things start, with a mistake she assumed would correct itself. A box of groceries had appeared on her porch one Wednesday afternoon in March. No note, no bill, nothing to indicate who had sent it or why. Ruth had called the number printed faintly on the delivery slip, certain there'd been some clerical error, and had been told, politely but firmly, that the order was prepaid, recurring, and attached to an account that the representative wasn't authorized to discuss. "Someone set this up for you," the young woman on the phone had said. "It's not a mistake. It's meant to keep coming." Ruth was 73 years old, a widow for going on 6 years now, living on a fixed income that covered her mortgage and utilities with almost nothing left over for anything beyond the essentials. She'd spent the better part of that first spring turning the mystery over in her mind. A distant cousin, perhaps, one of the 2 she still exchanged Christmas cards with, or some charitable program through her late husband's old union that she'd simply forgotten signing up for. She never landed on an answer that made complete sense, and eventually, worn down by her own persistent gratitude, she'd stopped questioning it quite so hard and simply let the groceries keep arriving. Her daughter Claire, who called every Sunday from 3 states away, found the whole thing faintly suspicious. "Mom, that's how scams work," Claire said, more than once. "Somebody gains your trust with something small, and then—" "And then what, dear? Asks me for my banking information over a bag of oatmeal?" Ruth had laughed it off every time, though she privately admitted the mystery nagged at her more than she let on. Whoever was doing this clearly knew things about her. Her preference for the store-brand tea over the expensive kind, the specific arthritis-friendly jar openers that had started appearing every few months, the extra can of soup added during the week she'd mentioned to no one but her own doctor that she'd been feeling under the weather. It was too specific to be a scam. It was too specific to be random charity, too. Somebody was paying close attention to her life, and had been for the better part of a year, without ever once wanting to be seen doing it. The truth arrived by accident, on a rainy Wednesday in November when Ruth's arthritis was bad enough that she'd been sitting by the front window rather than moving through her usual afternoon routine, and so she happened to be watching when the delivery van pulled up a full 10 minutes early. The driver wasn't the usual young man in the gray uniform. It was an older man, silver-haired, dressed simply in a canvas jacket that had clearly seen real wear, who climbed out of the driver's seat himself, rather than waiting for an employee to handle the bags. He carried them to her porch with a familiarity that struck Ruth as strange even before she got a good look at his face. The careful way he set them down exactly where the porch step met the railing, the brief pause afterward, like a man collecting himself before turning back to his van. Ruth, curiosity finally overriding 8 months of patient restraint, opened her door before he could leave. "Excuse me," she called out, "might I ask your name?" The man froze, halfway back to the van, and turned slowly, an expression on his face that Ruth would later describe to Claire as somewhere between being caught and being relieved to finally be caught. He was perhaps 60, with the kind of weathered, handsome face that suggested a life spent more outdoors than not, though something about his bearing, the quality of his jacket despite its worn appearance, the watch on his wrist that caught the gray afternoon light, didn't quite match the delivery uniform he clearly wasn't wearing today. "Mrs. Holloway," he said, and there was something careful in the way he said her name, like a man choosing his words with unusual precision. "My apologies, I wasn't planning on being seen." "You've been sending my groceries," Ruth said. It wasn't a question. "For 8 months. I've wondered every single week who was behind it." "I have," he confirmed, and made no move to deny it, no attempt at the polite fiction Ruth had half expected, that he was simply covering for the usual driver, that this was all some innocent misunderstanding she'd stumbled into. Would you mind if I came up? I think I owe you a proper explanation, and it's not the kind of thing that's easily shouted across a front yard in the rain. Ruth studied him a moment longer, weighing the strangeness of the situation against 8 months of quiet, careful kindness that had never once asked anything of her in return. Whatever else this man was, he hadn't behaved like someone with bad intentions. "Come in, out of the rain at least," she said. "I'll put the kettle on." He introduced himself properly once he was seated at her kitchen table. Hands wrapped around a cup of tea, he accepted this time rather than declined. "Warren Ashcroft," he said. "I don't imagine the name means much to you." It didn't. Not immediately, though something about it tugged faintly at Ruth's memory in the way names sometimes did. A headline glimpsed once and forgotten. A mention on the local news that hadn't registered as important at the time. Should it? "Ashcroft Manufacturing," Warren said. "The plant on Route 9, the one that closed down about 6 years ago, then reopened under new ownership about 18 months after that. I'm the new ownership, for whatever that's worth to you." Ruth set down her own cup slowly, pieces beginning uncertainly to click into place. "My husband worked at that plant," she said. 22 years. He was there when it closed." "I know," Warren said quietly. "That's exactly why I'm here." "I don't understand," Ruth said slowly. "You said the plant closed while my husband was still there. Were you the one who closed it?" "No," Warren said. "My father owned it then. I wasn't even involved in the business at that point. I'd spent most of my 20s trying to prove I could make it on my own, away from his name, away from any assumption that I'd simply inherit my way into a comfortable life. So I did something my father thought was foolish at the time. I took an entry-level position on the floor of one of our own plants, under a different last name, just to learn the work from the ground up before I ever set foot in an office that had my name on the door." Ruth's hands tightened slightly around her teacup. "You worked at Ashcroft, under my husband." "Frank trained me," Warren said, and something in his voice softened at the name, the particular tenderness of a memory carefully kept. "I went by Warren Ford back then, my mother's maiden name. Nobody on that floor had any idea who I actually was, least of all your husband, who took one look at a clumsy 26-year-old who barely knew which end of a wrench to hold and decided, for reasons I still don't fully understand, that I was worth the trouble of teaching properly." "That sounds like Frank," Ruth said quietly, a smile tugging at the corner of her mouth despite the strangeness of the moment. "He always said a person's worth showing you weren't sure yet." "He said something almost exactly like that to me once," Warren agreed. "About 4 months into the job, I made a mistake that could have shut down the whole line, misread a specification, ran an entire batch wrong, the kind of error that gets a green employee fired on the spot, and rightly so. Frank found it before it went any further. He could have reported it. Should have, honestly, by any normal standard. Instead, he quietly fixed it himself, on his own time, and never told a single person, including me, how close I'd come to losing that job." "He never mentioned that," Ruth said. "In 22 years, he never once mentioned covering for anyone like that." "He wasn't the type to mention it," Warren said. "That's exactly why it mattered so much. I asked him once, years later, after I'd finally told him who I actually was. This was maybe 3 years after that first mistake. Once I'd earned enough respect on that floor that I felt like I could admit it without it looking like I'd been playing some kind of trick on everyone. I asked him why he'd covered for me instead of reporting it. He said, 'Because you were trying. Most men who fail that hard just quit trying. You didn't.' I've thought about that sentence more times than I can count in the years since." Ruth was quiet for a long moment, absorbing this. A piece of her husband's life she'd never known existed, tucked away in a chapter of his working years he'd apparently never thought worth mentioning. Not out of secrecy, but out of simple, characteristic modesty. "When my father passed the company to me eventually," Warren continued, "the first thing I did, against the advice of nearly everyone on the board, was buy back the Ashcroft plant after it had been sold off, sitting half abandoned for years. I wanted to reopen it properly, the way it should have been run all along. I asked for the old employee records, hoping I might track down some of the men I'd worked alongside, offer them their jobs back if they wanted them." He paused. "That's how I found out Frank had passed. Heart attack, 4 years earlier, working a second job at a hardware store because the pension from the plant's closure hadn't been enough to cover the mortgage on this house. He never told me it was that close, Ruth said softly, her voice catching slightly. He always said we were managing fine. He was proud, Warren said. The same pride that made him cover for a stranger's mistake instead of reporting it probably made him keep that kind of worry from you too. So, you started the groceries, Ruth said, piecing it together at last. Out of guilt, because you felt like you owed him something you could never repay directly, so you found the next best thing. Partly, Warren admitted. I won't pretend guilt wasn't part of it, at least at first. I'd built an entire company on lessons that man taught me for free, out of nothing but decency, and by the time I went looking for him to say thank you properly, it was 6 years too late. But it stopped being only about guilt fairly quickly, Mrs. Halloway. I started asking around, quietly, about how you were doing. I learned you'd started skipping meals some weeks to make the numbers work. I couldn't fix Frank being gone. I could at least make sure his widow never had to choose between groceries and her heating bill again. Why the secrecy, though? Ruth asked. Why not simply introduce yourself? Tell me all this from the start. Warren considered the question with visible care. Because I didn't want it to feel like charity with strings attached. I didn't want you feeling obligated to perform gratitude toward a stranger, or worse, feeling like you had to entertain some rich man's guilty conscience over tea every week, just because he'd decided to write himself into your life. I wanted the groceries to simply be groceries, something that made your week a little easier, without turning into a transaction you had to manage. And today, Ruth asked, what changed? Nothing changed, Warren said. You caught me early. I've thought, more than once over these 8 months, about whether I owed you the truth outright, and I kept deciding against it, telling myself it was for your comfort. Watching you today, though, sitting at your own kitchen table asking me these questions with more grace than I probably deserve, I think I was protecting myself as much as I was protecting you. It's easier to give quietly from a distance than to sit across from someone and admit how much you owe them. Ruth reached across the table, an unplanned gesture, and rested her hand briefly over his. Frank would have liked you, she said, for whatever that's worth. He didn't take to many people quickly, but he took to people who worked hard and didn't make excuses. Sounds like that described you, even back then. It means a great deal, actually, Warren said, something visibly moved crossing his face. More than you probably realize. The groceries kept arriving every Wednesday after that, but the routine changed. Warren stopped hiding behind the delivery service entirely and began bringing them himself most weeks, staying afterward for tea, for the kind of unhurried conversation that neither of them had realized they'd been missing. He told her stories about the plant's early years under his father, about the slow, careful work of rebuilding it into something that treated its workers the way Frank always deserved to have been treated. Ruth told him about Frank's dry sense of humor, about the garden he'd kept meticulously in the backyard until his final year, about the particular way he used to whistle off-key while fixing things around the house that never actually needed fixing, simply because he liked having something to do with his hands. By spring, Warren had quietly funded a scholarship at the local community college in Frank's name for workers' children pursuing trade skills, the kind of practical education Frank himself had never had the chance to pursue but had always spoken of with a certain wistfulness. Ruth cut the ribbon at the small dedication ceremony herself, Warren standing a respectful distance behind her, content, it seemed, to let her have the moment entirely. You didn't have to name it after him, she told him afterward, watching a crowd of proud parents and nervous, hopeful teenagers mill around the modest plaque. I did, actually, Warren said. Everything good that came out of my running that company traces back to one afternoon when a foreman decided a clumsy stranger deserved a second chance instead of a pink slip. Seemed only right. The debt got paid forward properly, in his name, where people could actually see it. Ruth watched him a moment, this careful, quietly generous man who had spent 8 months delivering groceries in secret rather than ever asking for a single word of thanks, and felt something in her chest that she hadn't expected to feel again at 73, something she recognized, cautiously, as the beginning of genuine friendship, edging towards something warmer still. Wednesday, she said. Same time as always? Same time as always, Warren agreed. Assuming you'll still have me. Now that the mystery's solved, and there's no excuse left for the visits, except that I actually enjoy them. I think, Ruth said, smiling properly now, the kind of smile that hadn't come easily in the 6 years since Frank had passed. You'll find I'm rather fond of the company myself. He came the following Wednesday, and the one after that, and every Wednesday through the rest of that year and into the next. Not out of guilt anymore, not out of quiet obligation to a debt he could never fully repay, but simply because the small house on Larch Street had become, without either of them quite planning it, the place he most wanted to be at the end of every week. And Ruth had discovered that the mystery she'd spent 8 months trying to solve had, in the solving, given her back something she'd thought she'd lost for good the day Frank stopped coming home.